This series of podcasts is taken from a weekly book study group. The book under discussion is entitled Select English Poems by contemporary Indian philosopher A. Parthasarathy. It explores some of the key concepts of the ancient philosophy of Vedanta. The book contains 20 poems in all. This series comprises several of these. The discussion is led by myself, Glenn Callahan of Vedanta Institute, Los Angeles. Links to the websites of both the author as well as Vedanta Institute LA can be found in the description. They are respectively vedantaworld.org and vedantala.org. The poem currently under discussion is The Village Preacher by Oliver Goldsmith. So this is a portion taken from The Deserted Village, and what it does in this particular section is it describes, that's what he says at the very beginning of the commentary. Oliver Goldsmith's description of the village preacher portrays human perfection. The preacher's personality serves as an ideal for human beings to strive and reach. He says, near yonder copse where once the garden smiled, and still where many a garden flower grows wild, there where a few torn shrubs the place disclose, the village preacher's modest mansion rose. A man he was to all the country dear, and passing rich with 40 pounds a year. Remote from towns he ran his godly race, nor e'er had changed, nor wished to change his place. Unpractised he to fawn or seek for power, by doctrines fashioned to the varying hour, far other aims his heart had learned to prize, more skilled to raise the wretched than to rise. So he says, at the very beginning he's talking about where once the garden smiled, a few torn shrubs, etc. So he's talking about here that there's basically nobody left to tend to the garden. So it's showing a sort of a deserted, as the name of the original work suggests, a deserted village. So one of the ideas that contrasts with that is a little further down. He says, nor e'er had changed, nor wished to change his place. So there's this idea that people are attracted to the cities, the towns. The whole idea being, again, there's nothing wrong with moving to a city or a town to advance your options and your prosperity and your career and all that sort of thing. But when he contrasts it with the village preacher, nor ever had changed nor wished to change his place, he's giving two ideas. One is that idea of chasing something outside of yourself. I'm in my town, but I have to go to a bigger city if I really want to make it, if I really want those opportunities. So there's this idea of having to leave a place because you're dissatisfied with your current situation, with the fond hope that when I get there, things will be better off for me. And of course, you stay in that little place for a while, and it's busy, and it's crowded, and noisy, and it's got all those opportunities, but there's the downside to it as well. And so you move back to the country, where it's nice and quiet. There's always that thought of, the grass is greener on the other side. You contrast that with the village preacher. He had never changed his place, nor had he ever wished to. So what this is pointing at is a sense of contentment or satisfaction with current circumstances. Now, it's not a sense of complacency. It's not a sense of, good enough. No bother striving for more. What it means is that there's that recognition that whatever situation you get yourself into, there's always going to be the pros and the cons, the pluses and the minuses. Okay, I live in a small town. Well, not much opportunity for my career, but beautiful, clean air, nice and peaceful, small, close-knit community, etc. These are the benefits. So you move to the big town. Okay, your career is improved because you've got those opportunities and all of those things. But it's noisy, it's crowded, it's polluted, it's impersonal. So this is the correct understanding that no matter what situation I get myself into, there's always going to be positives about it, things that are improvements, and things that are negative about it. Pairs of opposites. So once we start to understand this idea, then we become more content with what we have. When we lack this genuine understanding, the only thing we focus on is what we don't have. And that sense of lacking something compels us, it propels us to move into a new environment, a new situation, to get rid of that sense of lacking. And so this is where gratitude is such an important part of our character development. Because it's gratitude which allows us to recognize what we have. So this is the village preacher, not concerned or not preoccupied with running his godly race in a much larger environment, having a wider sphere of influence, having more success as a village preacher. Not that he doesn't want to help as many people as possible, but that's not his primary concern. He's not feeling driven out of this environment so that he can go into a new one for greater success, because there was a sense of contentment with current circumstances, whereas everyone else had fled. The root of his contentment is being established in higher values. It's knowing what is important and what's not important. So the reason that he's contented, in shorthand, is because desires and attachment are not functioning in the personality. If I'm discontented with living in a small town, it means I have a desire for hustle and bustle, for noise, for people, for anonymity, for all that kind of stuff. So I have desires for those things. The village preacher lacks desires and attachments for all that kind of stuff. Why does he lack desires and attachment for those sorts of things? Because he's established in the knowledge of higher values. So how do you get established in that? So gratitude, and as we've talked about, gratitude, philosophical inquiry, acting in a spirit of service towards others, these are the causes. The effect of those is establishment in higher values. When you're established in higher values, you are content with current circumstances. It doesn't mean that you won't strive for more. You may be fully content in your current circumstances and be doing everything you can to strive for more. The common example we use is the weekend tennis player. You just like the game, you like hanging out with your friends, you like the exercise, and so you've got no interest in actually becoming a highly proficient tennis player, but that doesn't mean that you don't hone all of your skills. So when we say you've got no interest in it, what we're saying is there's no dependency upon it. So it doesn't mean that we won't strive for more, it just means that we're not dependent upon getting more for that sense of contentment. So gratitude as a starting point into the emotional practice is one of the ways that we can develop that contentment. So that's becoming established in the contentment. Gratitude is one of the methods. So that's the long-term view. But gratitude also has a short-term effect as well. When you actually implement it as a practice, you sit down. You might do it early morning. It might be one of the practices you do before you study, for example. You sit down early morning and you just rifle through the filing cabinet in your mind and just look for some of those things, the benefits that you enjoy in your life. It might start out being a little perfunctory, mechanical, you're sort of listing off the things that you know you're grateful for. And then you might hit on one thing, which you suddenly feel, aha, yes, I had kind of forgotten about that. And so you might do this as a practice. So when you do that as a practice, there's a local effect of heightening your sense of contentment with your current circumstances. But it's local in the sense that flush of emotion, of gratitude, and that feeling of contentment that you get, it gradually tapers off. As you go throughout the day and go throughout the week, that feeling sort of decays away. So you're not established in that feeling. You get it as a little peak experience when you do the practice, but then of course it decays off. But you can implement it on a daily or a weekly basis as a way of sort of keeping your mental equilibrium while you're doing all of the other work to get yourself permanently established in that sense of contentment. There where a few torn shrubs the place disclosed, the village preacher's modest mansion rose. So this is transferred epithet. The mansion is modest. It means it's small and not ostentatious, but it's the village preacher's. So this is, again, it's referring back to the village preacher. It's that sense of modesty. I don't need to show off. I don't need to appear to be more than what I am. Again, there's this sense of contentment with what is, and so you don't ask for more. You might have a beautiful house. You're not content with that. You want everyone to say how beautiful it is. So you host a dinner party and you take everyone around your house, and you're looking for appreciation. Not interested. The village preacher, not interested. A man he was to all the country dear, and passing rich with £40 a year. So again, this is hinting, or it's pointing at this idea of modesty, frugality, and passing rich with £40 a year. So £40 a year is rich. So it comes back to the definition of richness, which is, so your richness is your wealth divided by your desires. If your desires reduce to zero, you are infinitely wealthy. If your desires are many and varied, your richness tends towards zero. So richness is not a state of our circumstances. Richness is a subjective experience. If someone says to you, are you rich? How do you answer that question? Now, if you're being asked by someone who barely makes ends meet month to month, yes. So it's relative, is what we're saying. So the village preacher is passing rich with £40 a year. That's his stipend from the church, perhaps. £40 a year. He's rich. Why? Well, because he's got enough and to spare. So he feels rich. Remote from towns, he ran his godly race, nor e'er had changed, nor wished to change his place. So this is what I was talking about earlier. He's satisfied with his existing circumstances. Unpractised he to fawn or seek for power, by doctrines fashioned to the varying hour. Far other aims his heart had learned to prize, more skilled to raise the wretched than to rise. So this idea of doctrines fashioned to the varying hour, this again points at the desertedness of the village, that there are fads, there are trends, there is herd instinct, there is peer pressure. When we lack a sense of conviction in our own values, then we will be swayed by fashions, by fads, by peer pressure. What's interesting is that what we also need to understand about peer pressure or groupthink is that often we are influenced without knowing we are influenced. It may feel to us that we have made the decision based upon my own thinking. But what's actually happened is that because I am susceptible to the opinions of others and the feelings of others and the actions and choices, that what they do, I naturally start to feel a tendency to do as well, without realizing that I'm under the pressure of my environment. And so we may feel, I have made the choice to move to the big city. I have made the choice to get married. I have made the choice to have a child, etc. No. The environment is making that choice, and I'm susceptible to being swayed by the fashions and the fads of the people around me. I believe I've made that choice, but I haven't. So the whole idea of developing our capacity for critical thinking is two things. First of all, it means we take nothing for granted, which means that we don't presume anything to be correct. We don't presume anything to be true. When you can see that people are making a particular choice that they didn't have to make, moving to a big city, getting married, having kids, you also recognize, okay, this is a choice that I do or don't have to make. So taking nothing for granted, presuming nothing to be true, having no preconceived ideas. And the other aspect we also talk about is questioning everything. This requires, again, that introverted direction of our attention. When we are introverted, what happens is, if the mind does become influenced by the external environment, which we're all susceptible to, it's only a matter of degree. So let's put it another way. When the mind becomes influenced by the external environment, let's move to the big city. Let's find a partner. Let's have kids. You will immediately question that. So what this does, when we've developed our critical thinking, is it just gives us that barrier, it gives us that pause before we make the decision. Otherwise, we're swept away, or we're gently guided, you might put it that way. Now, if you're running in a big wide open space that has no tracks on it, and there's a wind blowing east to west, then you'll be gradually blown towards the west without quite knowing it. This is how it works. A little 1 degree off, and where we end up down the track is a huge difference to where we wanted to go. So that capacity to stop and question all of the tendencies that we find arising in the mind, this keeps us corrected. It keeps us functioning towards a designated endpoint. So, unpracticed he to fawn or seek for power. It shows the things that he has discarded. No interest in fawning, ingratiating himself into those who have wealth and power and fame, etc., to try and get a little of that himself. Has no interest in seeking for power of his own. Far other aims his heart had learned to prize. So what this means is that through practice, our desires change. Okay, we reduce the quantity of desires, but we also improve the quality. So his heart had learned to prize other aims. Wealth, fame, power, etc. No interest in those things. What had his heart learned to prize? More skilled to raise the wretched than to rise. So from his perspective, it is far more worthwhile for me to focus on raising others than it is to raise myself. He recognizes that as a much more worthy objective upon which to concentrate. So that's where we get this idea of the path of action. The path of action embodies that. The path of action means that you implement an ideal where your work enhances the lives and the well-being of others, of other conscious creatures. The only reason that we would do that is because we have recognized that this is something that is worth me doing. So that's interesting. He actually puts this directly. He says, far other aims his heart had learned to prize. His heart had actually learned to prize that. So it's not that a holy person or a person of this kind of stature is just born. It doesn't happen just by accident. It's something that we can actually learn to do. And again, it's the whole idea of being established in higher values. So it starts with an understanding. You express that understanding as karma yoga, as the path of action. You then become established in that value. You're established to a small degree, we can tell, just by virtue of the fact that at least I try it. But to become fully established in it, to become fully proficient in it, that requires the consistent effort. He continues. His house was known to all the vagrant train. He chid their wanderings, but relieved their pain. The long-remembered beggar was his guest, whose beard descending swept his aged breast. The ruined spendthrift, now no longer proud, claimed kindred there, and had his claims allowed. The broken soldier, kindly bade to stay, sat by his fire and talked the night away. Wept o'er his wounds, or tales of sorrow done, shoulders his crutch, and showed how fields were won. Pleased with his guests, the good man learned to glow, and quite forgot their vices and their woe. Careless their merits or their faults to scan, his pity gave ere charity began. Thus to relieve the wretched was his pride, and e'en his failings leaned to virtue's side. But in his duty prompt at every call, he watched and wept, he prayed and felt for all. So he says his house was known to all the vagrant train. And he gives a list, the beggar, the ruined spendthrift, the broken soldier, etc. What others might consider to be the dead wood of society. All these people who, what can you get from a broken soldier? What can you get from a beggar? What can you get from the vagrant train? Nothing. They can't offer me anything. They're dead wood, this sort of idea. Those sorts of people were well known to his home. Not only that, he's pleased with his guests. Right? So it's not just there's this sort of idea of, well, I'm a preacher. I've got to be nice to people. I have to open my home to the poor, etc. It comes with the job. So I do it. And he sits and he talks and it's not that there's a sense of condescension. This idea of being pleased with his guests is really important. It's a genuine sense of connection, it's a genuine sense of oneness. Whereas one person might look at the vagrant train and say it's the dead wood of society, there's nothing that I can benefit from there. He doesn't have that attitude. There's a sense of connectedness, of non-difference. It's very easy to be charitable, but do it from a position of superiority. I'm up here, you're down there, and I'm helping you. Very different thing is to offer that sense of charity from an equal position. And that's where we get this idea of being pleased with his guests. He also enjoys the company, he enjoys the contact. Not because of who the person is, but because of the way that he's relating to that person. It's the vagrant train, and yet he can draw honey from a weed, as it were, to sort of go back to the pineapple and the bee, because of the way that he relates to others. So pleased with his guests. It shows this sense of genuine affection. He says, he chid their wanderings but relieved their pain. So again, you can sort of see the relationship that he had. It was emotionally caring. He relieved their pain. He was there for them in that emotional way, but chid their wanderings. He wasn't afraid to chide them where necessary. If you sort of wander off track, I will call you out on it. I'll bring you back. I'll show you where you are wandering off track. Whereas when it comes to our personal relationships, often what we find is that we, in order to maintain a sense of harmony, which from our perspective simply means that there's no conflict coming at me, in order to avoid that conflict, in order to get the smile from my parent, my child, my friend, my whatever, my spouse, I don't chide their wanderings. So when they go a little off track, when they make a choice which is perhaps not in their best interests, I let it go. And I paint it with, oh, that person's their own free agent, they can do what they like, they have free will. No, I just don't want to get into a sense of conflict with that person. I'd rather have all the smiles. I'm dependent upon the relationship being a certain way, which means that I'm not strong enough to say what needs to be said when it needs to be said. Aha. Village Preacher shows us someone who has that emotional connection, that feeling of love and affection, but is not afraid to chide their wanderings when it's required. So that shows genuine interest in the other person's well-being. And quite forgot their vices and their woe. Careless their merits or their faults to scan, his pity gave ere charity began. So, no interest in being judgmental at all. He quite forgot their vices and their woe. He never looks at the person and says, these are your vices, these are the things you've done wrong which has caused you all of this suffering. He forgot their vices. So again, it's like that quote that we brought up from Morris Maeterlinck's, happy and blessed hour, when wickedness stands forth revealed as goodness bereft of its guide. So he sees the people that he's with, who are in states of varying distress, doesn't see their vices, just sees the human element and responds to it. So no interest in judging. Well, you brought this upon yourself. Okay, intellectually, conceptually, he may know, yes, the ruined spendthrift did bring it upon himself. Of course, he's responsible for it, but that's not the attitude he adopts. It's the knowledge that he has, but the attitude he adopts is, forget all that. Who am I to judge you? You look at that person, you never condemn his fallibility because you know, well, I've got my own. I've got a weakness for X, Y, Z, something else. We're both fallible. You in that area, me in this area. Okay. Or, if you're at a point where you're completely infallible, there's no ego. So in the same way, there's no sense of condemnation, there's no sense of judgment. It comes from being established in higher values, a correct assessment of human nature. This is what human nature is. And again, that doesn't mean that we let people express their vices, doesn't mean we let people behave any way they want. We have to correct the world, we have to take whatever action we think is necessary when we find others that are harming it. But we do it without that attitude of conflict, we do it without that attitude of resistance, of judgmental, which is detrimental to us making the right choice. How do we deal with that situation? The person who is corrupt, the person who is performing all these negative actions. You'll only be able to filter out all of the nonsense and find the correct choice to make once the mind is calm. So how do you get that calm mind? Just blow away all of that judgmentalness. Forget it. It's not relevant. His pity gave ere charity began. So charity referring to the actual ministering that he did. He may have given them food, he may have given them some coin, may have helped them out in various ways. That was the charity he did. But he gave his pity before the charity even started. In the context here, the word pity simply means that sense of empathy, that sense of compassion, the abiding spirit of wanting to share. So genuine empathy, or what you might call complete empathy, has a purely conceptual component, which means that you know conceptually what the other person is going through. So I see you crying and looking at your broken cell phone. I know exactly what you're going through. Your brand new cell phone is smashed and run over and you're suffering. The emotional component is to feel what the other person is feeling as well. It's not just to know the suffering that you're going through conceptually, but to actually be able to feel it. The third component is the willingness and the intention to serve that person's well-being. So this is complete empathy. So his pity was there before he gave charity. If we can maintain throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month, throughout our life, this attitude of just looking, anytime you enter into a situation, what is it that I can offer to this situation? What can I give? Where is a need that needs to be fulfilled that I can do something about? How can I advance the well-being of others? There's a constant outreach, as it were, of the mind's emotions to others. What it means is that our area of concern naturally includes everybody. This is the village preacher. Look at it, most of us now. Our area of concern extends out to, well, of course, ourselves, our immediate family, maybe our friends. What he's talking about here, when it comes to the village preacher, that circle of identification is constantly, consistently established in that much wider area. His pity gave ere charity began. So that circle of identification was already there. That feeling of oneness, that desire to serve other people's well-being, that was there before the charity began. Thus, to relieve the wretched was his pride, and even his failings leaned to virtue's side. But in his duty prompt at every call, he watched and wept, he prayed and felt for all. So the idea of having failings leaning to virtue's side, even if he had a failing, whatever his weaknesses were, he always erred or fell on the side of virtue. So it's like in Othello, the character is talking about Desdemona. It's something along the lines of, she holds it a vice in her goodness, not to do more than is requested. So it's a vice in her that she worries. Somebody has come to me and they've asked me for help, and I've given the help. But her vice is, maybe I didn't give enough. Maybe I should have given more. I should have asked if they wanted more. Maybe I should have given. She considers that a vice. To only do what was requested. Someone comes and asks for help, you give it. But I didn't give more. That's a vice. So her vice falls on the side of virtue. You go to somebody's house. Would you like something to drink? Are you hungry? Would you like something to eat? You need to rest? There's a room upstairs, you want to rest? They're looking to make you feel comfortable. They want you to feel relaxed. They want your well-being. But they're doing a little over the top. It's a vice that falls on the side of virtue. Thus, to relieve the wretched was his pride. So we usually consider pride to be, sort of in philosophical terms, the word pride is often considered an expression or a manifestation of ego. In the Gita, he talks about this. There are qualities of a perfect human being, and one of them is having no pride. So the idea of pride then is that feeling of accomplishment that the ego gets from having done something. Well, what does he feel pride about? Relieving the wretched. So it's a failing, but it's a failing that leans towards a virtue. And in his duty prompt at every call, he watched, he wept, he prayed and felt for all. Prompt at every call. In his duty, prompt at every call. So this is indicating a mental state of sattva. The mental temperament of sattva is one in which the person is very calm, very composed, highly attuned and highly sensitive to what his or her obligations are, and performs them with alacrity. Very enthusiastic. When it needs to get done, he does it. He's prompt. Compare that with someone who has a tamasic temperament. There's two aspects of tamas that we can look at. One is, first of all, the fact that when we're in a state of tamas, we don't recognize what our obligations are. The intellect is too occluded, it's too deluded, it can't see what the obligations are. Second aspect is that sense of laziness, of lethargy, of procrastination. So if at all the tamasic person sees what his obligations are, he puts them off and puts them off and puts them off until circumstances demand that it has to get done. Here, someone who is sattvic immediately recognizes what his obligations are and does them promptly. And again, with that sense of enthusiasm. And as a bird each fond endearment tries to tempt its new-fledged offspring to the skies, he tried each art, reproved each dull delay, allured to brighter worlds and led the way. Beside the bed where parting life was laid, and sorrow, guilt, and pain by turns dismayed, the reverend champion stood at his control, despair and anguish fled the struggling soul. Comfort came down the trembling wretch to raise, and his last faltering accents whispered praise. At church with meek and unaffected grace, his looks adorned the venerable place. Truth from his lips prevailed with double sway, and fools who came to scoff remained to pray. The service passed around each pious man, with steady zeal each honest rustic ran. E'en children followed with endearing wile, and plucked his gown to share the good man's smile. His ready smile, appearance warmth expressed, their welfare pleased him, and their cares distressed. So he says, as a bird tempts its new-fledged offspring to the skies. So what he's talking about here is two things. One is, you look at the life of a bird, a mature bird, compared to one that's in the nest. The difference is incredible. You're stuck in that nest. You don't move from there. You have to wait for mother bird to bring you food. There's a sense of comfort, yes, but there's a very limited, constrained existence because you don't know anything else. And so what does the mother bird do? It tries to lure the younger birds out of the nest. How does it do it? Well, first of all, it drags food just a little out of the nest and forces them to come out. Then it moves away from the nest. It leads the way. So what the bird is doing is trying to bring the youngsters out of the nest and into the skies. So this is what he's talking about with regards to the village preacher being a spiritual leader. Later on he says, appearance warmth expressed. So again, there's that idea of being a parent, of being an educator, of being a leader, a bringer up of others. So this is the attitude that the village preacher is taking. He's trying to bring people from that state of limitation into that state of liberation. He knows it. The mother bird knows what it's like to fly through the skies, that sense of freedom, that sense of expansion. That's the natural place for a bird to be. Not in the nest, not in a cage. It's just the most depressing thing you can see. I can't imagine people going down every morning, seeing the bird and getting a little kick of joy out of it. Hey birdie. What's the life of a bird compared to the life of a bird in a cage? So this is what the mother bird knows. This is what the village preacher knows. I know what you're capable of. I know the freedom that you can experience. So what does he do? He tries to lure them out of their constraint, lure them out of their limitation. Not just by leading the way, but also, as he says, tried each art, reproved each dull delay. So again, it's this idea of trying all the different ways and means to bring that person to their own highest well-being. Happy to condemn what is the wrong thing that you're doing, and happy to give you praise and support where needed for the right thing. And leads the way. Has travelled that way, or is at least travelling that way himself. Truth from his lips prevailed with double sway, and fools who came to scoff remained to pray. So it's showing that when he spoke, there was influence there, double sway, knowledge and wisdom. Not just supporting those who are already, in a sense, in agreement, but also able to actively turn the tide, to turn the minds of those who initially aren't in agreement. And fools who came to scoff remained to pray. That's the power of his capacity to speak. Now, where does that come from? It's knowledge and wisdom. Not only does he know the stuff, but he's living it. So this is this idea of leading the way. When the person is speaking from subjective experience, it holds more power. When the person is speaking purely from theory, it's a great theory, and we can all sit and think about it and agree with it, but it doesn't quite have the same effect. Beside the bed, etc. So it's, again, showing this idea that his ability to connect with those who are suffering. What effect does it have? Despair and anguish fled the struggling soul. At church with meek and unaffected grace, his looks adorned the venerable place. Meek and unaffected grace, humility. So again, this idea of meekness isn't taken to mean timidness. The person's not timid. Meek here simply means, again, that absence of ego and unaffected grace. There's no affect. You know, often you think about someone having an affect, it's a sort of mask that the person wears as a way to relate to the world. You know, you can say a person he's got this strange affect of always grinning and laughing. So every time you're talking to him, he's a very jolly, jolly fellow. Okay, it's great when you first meet him, it's very endearing, but after a long period of time, that affectation, it becomes something of an annoyance, and you recognize it as a veneer, as a barrier to an authentic connection. Now, what's his grace like? What's his meekness like? It's unaffected. It's not a put on. He's not faking it. And so that unaffected grace. So it's showing that lack of ego. The service passed around the pious man, with steady zeal each honest rustic ran. So people follow after him, children follow after him. There's a sense of joy that comes from connecting with him. You know, people mill around him. There's that magnetic personality. As he says, children pluck his gown so he can turn around and they can share his smile. So this sort of magnetic personality, what people are experiencing, the joy that they're experiencing, is the selflessness. You know, when they get in the presence of such a person, there's just a feeling of comfort, there's a feeling of being connected, there's a feeling of being accepted, all of these sorts of ideas. What they're experiencing is the selflessness, that magnetism that some people seem to have. It's because their selfless attitude. Think of it in the reverse. When you see someone who has a strong affectation in the way that they function, you know, the stereotypical car salesman, right? Nothing against car salesmen, but the stereotype. You know, think of the cheap jacket and the false compliments and all the rest of it. You recognize the whole thing's an affectation purely to get me to buy cars in his lot. You can see it. It's obvious. And that is off-putting. You don't want to have an authentic personal connection with that salesman when you can recognize all of that inauthenticity in him. But the moment you are able to recognize genuine selflessness in another human being, it's natural that we tend to reciprocate. If we want another person to drop their ego in a particular situation, you can't bully someone into dropping their ego. You can't cajole them. The best way to get the person to drop their ego is to drop yours. It gives the other person the maximum chance of dropping their own. And then you'll choose to act however is most appropriate. Dropping your ego, again, doesn't necessarily mean being really nice and being very pleasant. Dropping your ego simply means dropping your ego. What you do thereafter will be dictated by circumstances. You might have to be very blunt. You might have to reprove each dull delay. You might have to chide their wanderings. You might have to give them that beautiful emotional outreach. Whatever you do is irrelevant. The point is that when we do it without ego, the natural tendency is that the other person's ego will also drop. And that's why the other person also experiences such joy. Nothing is more pleasurable than the reduction of the ego. When the ego diminishes, they experience the joy, and of course attribute it to that person, which partly is true. But that selflessness is very attractive, in the way that selfishness is very repulsive. Their welfare pleased him, and their cares distressed. So this is a pretty nice definition of love. So when we talk about love, we use the word oneness, we use the word identification. What that means is you feel what the other person is feeling. You go through what they are going through. It's a sense of non-difference. It doesn't mean that you lose yourself. We're not talking about fusion. We're not talking about emotional contagion. We're not talking about losing ourselves sort of in this coalescence of feeling. That person's joys become your own joys. When that person's well-being is enhanced, you experience it as well. When that person suffers, you experience that suffering. So it's important that we understand what it doesn't mean. Think of it this way. Let's say you are highly attached to someone. Now that person goes through some tragedy. You will naturally suffer along with them, but you're affected by the feeling. Okay, so your son fails an exam or has a car accident or something like that. Some tragedy befalls him. He's suffering. You can't sleep at night. You can't eat anything. You can't concentrate on your obligations and your work and other members of your family. You neglect them. Why? Because you're so caught up in what your son's going through. You're feeling what he's feeling, but you're affected by it. You're useless. You can't help anybody because you're so mentally agitated. What genuine love is, we enhance our capacity to feel what others are feeling, but along with it, we gain a sense of autonomy. We gain a sense of objectivity. So this is why love is, it's a feeling in the sense that we use that term, but it's an intellectual phenomenon. In The Fall of the Human Intellect, he has this wonderful quote: "You must therefore develop and use your intellect to protect and preserve your love." Genuine love always has that intellectual component as well, which is the objectivity. So what that means is that while you're going through the same feelings that you did, or the same feelings that your son is going through with his tragedy, at no point are you affected by it. You can still perform all of your obligations. When you go to work, you can switch off that and switch on to this. Okay, this is where I'm focusing now. You still have emotions and care to give to other people. The experience isn't draining all of your emotions. It's very much like the analogy that we always use of watching a movie. When you watch the movie, the protagonist goes through some tragedy. You feel it. You feel his heartbreak, you feel his loss, you feel his tension, his fear, his frustration. But you're never affected by it. In the same way, that's genuine love. You feel it. You go through it fully as much as the other person does, if not more, but you remain unaffected. Your own sense of subjectivity doesn't get shifted. Who and what you are remains steady. While the emotions are feeling the sorrow of the son, while the intellect is helping to figure out the best way to strategize out of it, you remain unaffected. So the example of watching movies is a really good one. Because obviously the emotions are changing. The emotions are going on a roller coaster according to what's happening on the screen. But there's something that is not on the roller coaster. There's something that remains unaffected by the shifting, sweeping emotions. That's the thing that you identify with, and that's how you remain unaffected. Which sort of brings us into the final part of the poem. To them his heart, his love, his griefs were given, but all his serious thoughts had rest in heaven. As some tall cliff that lifts its awful form, swells from the vale and midway leaves the storm, Though round its breast the rolling clouds are spread, eternal sunshine settles on its head. So this is showing that supreme state of objectivity. So you imagine the mountain lifting its awful form as an awe-inspiring form. Halfway up the mountain you see clouds. There's stormy weather, it's wet, it's raining, etc. Go above the clouds to the peak and perfectly clear blue skies. So that mountain is representing the state of the village preacher. To them his heart, his love, his griefs were given. So that's the emotions. The emotions are constantly swirling around. What emotions is he going through? Love, grief, according to the dictates of the circumstances. But there's an aspect of his personality which is above the weather, above that turbulence. At the peak, in his head, eternal sunshine settles. So basically what he's talking about here is that state of objectivity. How is it gained? As he says, but all his serious thoughts had rest in heaven. Serious thoughts means where we are choosing to consciously place our attention because we know this is the most important thing. So that's his serious thoughts. So while you're playing and joking and laughing with your kids, there's another serious thought that might be going on. They're playing by the water, so let's make sure no one falls in. There's a serious thought going on as well. That gives us that objectivity. So what he's talking about here is whatever it is that the mind is going through, whatever it is that the emotions are going through, we retain that sense of objectivity by ensuring that our serious thoughts rest in heaven, which we understand as meaning that the intellect maintains the consistent thought of the higher. So heaven is used here to symbolize the higher values of life. The highest value of life being self-realization. Whenever we are able to do that, whenever we're able to maintain that thought of our ideal, that's where we reside. That's the subjective place that we are functioning from. So go back to the example of being affected. If I'm maintaining that thought of the higher values, if I'm maintaining the thought of the ideal, that's what determines my subjective reality. If I'm identifying with the emotions, then that's what determines my reality. And so when my emotions go on the roller coaster, I go on the roller coaster, I'm affected. If I'm identifying with my highest value, that's fixed. That's constant. And because it's a higher value, because it's less egocentric, it has a naturally more joyful, peaceful quality to it. So I identify with the higher values, that's what determines my subjective experience. The rolling clouds, they are changing, but I am not. I'm objective to what my mind is doing because I'm able to identify with the higher values of life. Eternal sunshine settles on its head. Once we become established in those higher values, it doesn't shift. Eternal sunshine is talking about the fact that the person has achieved it as a permanent state. So through consistently applying our thoughts towards the higher values of life, we grow in that direction and ultimately reach a stage of maturity. Human perfection.